Good morning and good day to all of you online, depending on what time of the day it is for you. I really mean it when I say I count it a very special privilege to be invited to give the inaugural lecture for the Center for Global Witness and Human Migration. I've had many conversations with Harvey about his work, his interests, and this initiative. I feel that this is one of those projects. You want to be on the ground floor. You want to be part of how this, is set up and unfolds. And I'm truly excited for the work he's doing. I think of Harvey as a quiet, disarming revolutionary. And since he's Malawian, he knows what I mean. But I think revolutionary being used by God in extraordinary ways. Interestingly, this is the second time I've been invited to give an inaugural lecture in Oxford in connection with the CMS. And I feel there's a reason for that. I have a deep affinity with the CMS, deeper than you think. I think that affinity has a certain ancestral dimension to it, even, if you will, a DNA, connection. And I say that because I'm from Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone was the first missionary field of the CMS. And so there is that connection that, I'm always sort of eager, excited, and, just filled with a certain sense of new optimism. And listening to Johnny talk about new things, I always just feel that sense of, oh, yeah, this is the kind of thing I want to be associated with. But let's get to the topic I have in mind. So you need to click on the... Yeah. So I use slightly older data. In 2020, according to UN estimates, there were 281 million international migrants, people living outside their country of birth in the world. This is the highest, it's as Harvey pointed out, it's obviously much more than that now. This is the highest number of people living abroad in recorded history. And I tell audiences that if they all lived in the same place, that place would be the world's fourth largest country. But remember, when it comes to human migration, cold statistical data is always outdated. More people have moved since you and I have been here than anything I would put up on the slide. But cold statistical data never tells the whole story. It never conveys an accurate picture. That's because migrant data is always incomplete. So that's something we must bear in mind. But also we need to remember that the numbers you would see on a screen like this represent horrendous, often hidden cases of human suffering, ruined lives, and unimaginable pain. So, roughly one person was forcibly displaced every 2 seconds, as a result of conflict or persecution in 2019. And it's gotten much worse. And so I'll allow you to read the data on the slides, whether you're here or online. You see, friends, as we gather to think about international migration, there's some things we have to bear in mind. Global migratory flows are both an expression and an indictment of our broken world. And it should be abundantly clear by now that this phenomenal tide of human migration is unmanageable and unstoppable. And here's what I typically use to illustrate that. The catastrophic COVID-19 pandemic. You see, remember, the pandemic erupted in a world already marked by a tidal wave of international migrants. And for a while, it looked like global mobility would never be the same again. In a matter of weeks, at least 174 countries had implemented travel bans and border closures. By May 2020, 90% of the world's population lived in countries with largely closed borders. But friends, here's the thing. Even in the face of unprecedented global travel restrictions, the challenge or dilemmas surrounding global migrations did not go away. The crisis of mass migration and the calamitous displacement of peoples did not cease. Throughout 2020 and 2021, unprecedented violence and displacement continued in the Sahel region. The abrupt withdrawal of the U.S. military from Afghanistan also triggered another massive wave of migrant movements. Then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 that set off what was regarded as the fastest mass migration in Europe in at least 3 decades. And a year later, bloody conflict erupted in Sudan that has also triggered the world's fastest growing displacement crisis. In fact, the year leading up to May 2023 marked the largest ever single-year increase in first displacement in the history of the UNHCR. Needless to add, the year-long conflict in the Middle East has contributed huge numbers to this. In just the last week alone, tens of thousands of Lebanese have fled their homes in the midst of another catastrophe. Why am I reminding you of all this, you might ask? Well, the mind-boggling data and ubiquitousness of migration and displacement in our time may leave the impression that this situation is novel. This is simply not true. The scale of human migration is unprecedented, but the reality is not. To say that we live in an age of migration is a nice catchphrase, but it's misleading in some ways. So as I state at every opportunity, human migration is a fact of history. For as long as human beings have inhabited the planet, relocation, displacement, and population transfers have marked the human condition. Indeed, in the whole of human existence, permanent settlement is the exception. More to the point, migration has been a constant and influential feature of human history. Relevantly, the global religious landscape is largely the product of complex migration movements. That's because historically, people have been the oldest, most important, most influential agents of cultural transmission. As most, if not all of you in this room and online know, migrants do not take everything with them, but they take a lot, including their ideas, their beliefs, their religious practices, their spirituality. All of this leads to an obvious question. If human migration has been consequential for human development and largely accounts for the global religious landscape, why is the theme of human migration so conspicuously absent from historical accounts of Christianity? What accounts for this silence or this neglect? There are literally hundreds of published volumes and printed texts that provide detailed assessment of the history and global spread of Christianity. If you're a student, you might be thinking to yourself, perhaps too many. These volumes occupy pride of place in university, theological libraries, and some of you see them every time you survey your impressive personal book collections. These texts have been used to train and educate generations of theological students, pastors, and academics. Many of them written by top scholars or titans of historical research and knowledge. Feel free to think of your favorite church historian. Kenneth Latourette, Von Harnack, Owen Chaddick, W.H.C. Friend, and so on. These were prodigious writers and profound thinkers who have had a monumental impact on the historical study of Christianity. It would be unacceptable to discount their scholarly contributions. In fact, we all stand on their shoulders. But what I'm drawing attention to is not the scholarly output of any one historian, but to the discourse as a whole. The historical study of Christianity is not only dominated by Western scholars, it has also been shaped largely by the Western intellectual tradition. So while there is no question about the immense value and impressive intellectual output of this Western scholarship, the blind spots or limitations are seldom acknowledged. There is the obvious Eurocentrism in assumptions and approaches which prioritize Western heritage and experience in historical construction, favor the study of Christianity as the development of Western doctrine and institutions, promote historical periodization that implicitly casts developments outside the West as supplemental to the main narrative. And you can quote me on this. Medieval is a European category. It has no universal application. But these predilections are well known. I want to draw attention to a different aspect that has received little attention but is no less entrenched. The predominance of a theoretical framework that privileges structures of power as an interpretative model that is unrepentantly top-down. I've described this model as the empire logic. This model, in my view, helps to explain why migrant movement and action is largely missing in the historical study of Christianity. Let me explain. See, the empire argument or logic refers to a top-down analytical framework, emphasizes structures of power, dominant voices or contribution, and institutional authority. Historian Philip Curtin puts it this way. Western historians have often concentrated on the doings of great men, top nations, or great civilizations, unconsciously setting aside the activities of women, the ordinary run of men, or societies whose achievements fail to attract Western admiration. Unquote. You see, the empire argument presents history as a series of dramatic events in which the exploits and contributions of powerful individuals, usually men, are crucial. Friends, this top-down view of historical processes is especially prominent in texts that cover the global spread of religion. Regardless of the origin, social context, or the outcomes, from medieval Europe to Persia to Central Asia to Tang China, Western historical scholarship typically focuses on dominant structures, use of power, political ambition, superior resources, efforts by institutional elites, economic self-interest, and military action. Again, let me be clear. These are all legitimate themes. These elements are often vital to the story and have great explanatory power. The point I'm making is that the dominance of this empire argument as an analytical construct can obscure important insights and, from a non-Western perspective, even mislead. History is not simply a series of dramatic events. The exploits and contributions of prominent or powerful individuals and the sizable impact of institutions, think synods, tribunals, are part of the story, but that's never all of the story. Not every major historical transformation can be explained in terms of hegemonic power. However useful this interpretative approach, it does not give us access to the whole story. It can explain some things, but not others. In fact, the empire logic leaves many critical historical elements unaccounted for because by design it minimizes commonplace experiences like migration. It largely overlooks the impact and contribution of ordinary peoples, marginalized groups, or groups out of power. This is why we are here in a way. You see, in all ages, ordinary people, including migrant outsiders, have also functioned as agents of historical change or contribute to wider historical processes. But discerning this impact requires a more bottom-up approach that attends to wider developments shaping human experience. Extensive research into human migration as a central component of religious change and expansion quickly exposes the limitations of the empire tool of analysis. In my experience, applying migration as a lens for historical study provides a more comprehensive and meaningful account of Christianity as a global religion and a lived faith. So, I'm standing before you today because I've spent over 2 decades in research and study of migration. In the 2 major works I have produced on this subject, I've made the case that migration was pivotal in the global spread of Christianity from the earliest beginnings, and that the migrations of Christians have been a prominent contributing factor to the globalization of the faith, for the simple reason that every Christian migrant is, in fact, a potential missionary. And in my own assessment of the global spread of Christianity in the first 1,500 years of its existence, I make the case that institutional authority and agents that are commonly considered indispensable for global Christian expansion actually played a minimal role. That the rise of Christianity as a world movement in the first 15 centuries was predominantly through the agency and activity of migrants. Now, I actually believe that this assessment has far-reaching implications for missiological thinking and practice. You see, the historical study of Christian missions is maybe less captive to Western constructs, but it is no less captive than the historical study of Christianity to the empire logic. So the vast literature on the Western missionary movement from the 16th century also makes scant reference to the crucial role of migrant flows. And that, it seems to me, that neglect, it seems to me, also impairs assessments of the impacts and legacy of the Western missionary movement. So it is true that this movement coincided with a world order that was largely the creation of Western powers. It is true that the ambitions and designs of colonial powers shaped missionary outlook and structures. But it is also clear that the mechanisms and subtle complexities of global migration shaped the operations and outcomes of the Western missionary movement in profound ways. For one thing, from the 16th to the mid-20th century, this missionary movement coincided with the largest human migration in history up to that point. So in just over a 100-year period, between 1800 and 1925, between 50 to 60 million Europeans, about a fifth of the entire European population, moved to overseas destinations. Only the movement of Chinese at the same time comes close. So essentially, the tide and flow of European missions was a significant undercurrent in this much broader sweep of migration movements. In essence, the largest migration movement on record at the time also coincided with, in direction and duration, with the most extensive missionary movement in history. Individual European missionaries were migrant outsiders in every sense and almost everywhere they worked. You know, I sometimes think to myself, perhaps one reason why assessments of the Western missionary movement miss the migrant factor has to do with this strange reluctance of Western scholars to apply the term migration or migrant to the movements of white people. So, the earliest European settlers in the U.S. are described in history books as colonialists. The term migrant or immigrant is reserved for all those who came after. In our own day, Westerners who settle in foreign countries are almost always referred to as expats, not immigrants, and certainly not labor migrants. When the Russian invasion of Ukraine caused over 10 million people to flee in 50 days, Western newscasters did everything possible to avoid combining the words European and refugee in the same sentence. These same newscasters who have been going on and on about the Syrian refugee crisis, suddenly the only thing they could bring themselves to use was crisis. So the Associated Press described it as Europe's largest crisis since World War II. But I would give the prize to an ITV correspondent who declared, I quote, "The unthinkable has happened. This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe, unquote. See, friends, the basic concept is clear enough. When our analysis incorporates the basic fact that the Western missionary movement actually demonstrated how global migrations have historically shaped the church's mission, then it becomes much easier, missiologically speaking, to understand that this current age of global migratory flows also incorporates patterns and dynamics that point to the unfolding of a new missionary movement, even if the scale and substance is without precedence in the history of Christianity. So let's talk about this new age. Well, I've already said that describing it as the age of migration is misleading in some sense. Unrelenting, irrepressible mass migrant movements, really this has been part and parcel of the human condition. But the phrase does hint at the fact that there are more people on the move today globally than ever before. But there is one unique feature of this age of migration, and that is the intensification of anti-immigrant attitudes and measures worldwide. Anti-immigrant hostility is not confined to wealthy developed nations. Even before the pandemic, Pew polls of countries around the world show that on average, 45% of inhabitants in most countries say fewer or no immigrants should be allowed into their country. But here's the thing, friends. In an age when more people are on the move than ever before, antipathy towards immigrants is more pervasive than ever before. All over the world, from India to South Korea to South Africa to Brazil, you can go on and on. We find these impulses present in strong and unrelenting ways. But I would suggest, because my presentation this morning is going to be focused on Europe and North America, I would suggest that anti-immigration is a more prominent phenomenon in Western countries for at least three reasons. First, it is more specifically anti-non-white immigration. Second, it constantly fuels public debate. And third, it impacts electoral politics more decisively. Well, let's go back to the pandemic. You see, ultimately, the rigorous travel restrictions and unprecedented border closures stimulated by the COVID-19 pandemic did little to stem global migratory flows in the long run. The pandemic, by the way, also radicalized anti-immigrant sentiments, but we'll leave that to the side for now. The point of fact is that international migration surged after the pandemic. So far from curtailing it, it actually simply acted almost like a pressure valve, and when it was released, international migration spiked. By May 2023, the foreign-born population in wealthy countries was, in one analysis, rising faster than at any point in history. So rising faster than even before the pandemic. I don't need to remind you that anti-immigration was one of the most powerful impulses behind Brexit. Yet post-Brexit has experienced an unprecedented rise in migration from other parts of the world. In fact, according to the assessments I was looking at, in 2023, 1.2 million people moved to Britain. Likely the most ever in a single year in records. The same was true elsewhere else. Canada had a record-breaking number of migrants in 2022. In the U.S., by 2023, there were 2.5 million migrant encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, the highest ever on record. And by the way, on that issue, let me just mention real quick that the majority of migrants at the U.S. border are increasingly not from Latin America. Just want to put that out there for you and those of you on the line. We can talk about this more on the side. So essentially, not only did a global pandemic fail to stem international mobility in the long term, but it also ushered in a new global migrant reality, leading The Economist to declare in May 2023, I quote, "A new wave of mass migration has begun," unquote. But this brings me back to the original point I was making. That typical for this age of global mobility, this new wave of mass migration almost immediately triggered a backlash. And so, in the UK, efforts to stop all asylum seekers from coming to Britain. By the way, asylum seekers settled in the UK represent 0.6% of the population. And then introduction of tougher visa rules which ban most immigrants from bringing family. Sweden, just last month, August 2024, the country's migration minister celebrated the fact that asylum applications and asylum-related permits had decreased to such an extent that more people were leaving the country than entering it for the first time in over 50 years. Canada has long had a reputation for being one of the most immigrant-friendly countries. But earlier this month, polls show growing numbers of Canadians now believe that the country has too many immigrants. In the U.S., the latest Gallup poll from July this year indicates that 55% of U.S. adults would like to see immigration to the U.S. decreased. Why is that significant? Because that's the highest percentage recorded since the 9/11 attacks. So, it would be a grave error to romanticize this new age of migration in our eagerness to evaluate what it means for Christian witness. These are important background elements. Indeed, amidst escalating animosity towards legal immigration, increasing gains by far-right factions, open vitriol towards non-white migrants, we must reckon with the fact that the greatest danger to Christian witness in this new age, and this is my assessment, comes not from the general public's growing anxiety or anger over migration, but from within the church. Let me explain. No other phenomenon, in my view, is likely to have a more negative impact on the witness of the church in our time than this phenomenon known as Christian nationalism. Now, Christian nationalism is a complex phenomenon. It can take a variety of forms and expressions, and its presence and vigor varies from one country to another, but its basic convictions are clear enough. Christian nationalism conflicts Christian identity with a particular cultural heritage, with specific territorial boundaries, and with established Western values. Christian nationalism prioritizes political power and influence over personal piety. Christian nationalism views Christian beliefs and practices as markers of belonging that indicate who does not fit in. And of course, I think this is broadly known that it opposes multiculturalism and views non-white immigration negatively. So, in 2018, a Pew survey of 15 countries in Western Europe made two major discoveries. First, that negative sentiment towards immigrants and religious minorities are higher among those who claim to be Christian. And that Christians as a whole express higher levels of nationalist sentiment. Another analysis around the same time revealed that, I have to quote this, when the percentage of a given population reaches the point where it is composed of approximately 4 to 5% immigrants from outside the EU, nationalism becomes intertwined with religion, unquote. In the U.S., recent surveys show that Christian nationalism is endorsed and embraced by 30% of Americans, even though it's more prevalent among white evangelical Christians. But friends, remember that Christian nationalism exists on a spectrum. You know, from those who are kind of interested or sympathetic, all the way to those who are ardent advocates and public apologists. So I want to be clear. You can't tell a Christian nationalist just by looking at the person, in case you're thinking of somebody. But according to a 2023 study, 52% of Americans who attend religious services weekly or more are Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. Friends, we must always consider the complexity and fluidity, I should say, of religious beliefs and identity. But it is also important to acknowledge the fact that churches, Christian ministries, and organizations, including this one, are on the front lines of advocacy for refugees and providing vital services for migrants. Over 350 churches, I read somewhere, in Berlin provide sanctuary for refugees, where perhaps everyone in this room is associated with initiatives like this in some way. So I want to be clear that I'm not presenting a wholesale condemnation of the Western church. But I want to be clear about this as well, that the growing sympathy or support for convictions associated with Christian nationalism in our pews and pulpits can no longer be ignored. It matters that antipathy to non-white immigration and rejection of a multicultural society are higher among those who are religious and those who attend church regularly. It matters that this phenomenon is partly fueled by deep anxiety around erosion of cultural dominance. Because Christian nationalism is in some ways strongly tied to a decline in Christian affiliation. And this actually explains its greatest predicament: the tendency to prioritize cultural identity over allegiance to Christ. The tendency to even put political power above the good news of the gospel and what it means to be a global community of faith. Let me close with some reflections and one major critique that is pertinent to this age of Christian witness. And this has to do with the extensive overlap between global migration flows in our time and Christian representation. And this overlap, in my own view, implicates Western societies as major sites of new Christian engagement and missionary encounters. So, there are two components to this. The decline in Western Christianity, I can imagine some of you mentally rolling your eyes. I don't want to simply revisit these facts about, more than half of the British public say they don't belong to any religion and so on. But I'm putting it up to remind you that the nature and extent of this decline varies from country to country. Okay? Because I think that's often, overlooked. And that, at least according to this 2018 assessment, most adults in Western Europe still identify as Christian, 64%. But yes, it is true that the decline is, of course, extends way beyond Europe. You have Canada and the U.S. Americans who identify as Christian now account for 63% of the population, which is interestingly almost the same as Western Europe as a whole. But even there, some nuances can be missed because long-term decline is more pronounced among Protestants than Catholics. And that for many analysts, it's the fact that 27% of all Americans now describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated that is the most profound shift in recent histories. So that's why I'm putting it up, just to say there's some things there that we need to be paying attention to in a analysis and missiological assessments. Now, everyone here in the room and online, you're familiar with the converse of these trends, that by 2020, 67% of the world's Christians resided in the global south. Most people are aware already that the future of world Christianity largely rests in the hands of Christians living outside the West. But even there, I think there are nuances that we're not paying attention to. Really, I'm just calling attention to the fact that these trends can become so familiar that we stop paying attention to some of the critical implications. In the case of the shift to the non-Western world, there are questions we have to ask as to, for instance, how power structures rooted in colonialism still shape interactions and are contributing to major fractures and shifts as we try to exist as a global community of faith. In a recent analysis, renowned post-colonial feminist theologian Kwok Pulan lamented the fact that in analysis of global Anglicanism, on most critical issues, it is the voices of male bishops, clergy, and theologians that dominate all conversations. And she points out that the marginalization of women's voices is particularly egregious given the outsized role of women's contribution to global Anglicanism. And she noted, among other things, that the demographic shift of Anglican churches to the global south is largely the work of women in the church. Dana Roberts has made a similar assessment of the shift as a whole. So what I'm saying is, I'm just encouraging us who are familiar with these, facts to start paying attention, looking under the hood, so to speak, a little bit more to understand and discern further and deeper implications. But let's get to the Christian element in migration before I run out of time. So the data we have on the proportion of Christians among the world's international migrants, which has been growing and extraordinary rapid rates for the past 5 decades or so, there's a consistent pattern since 1990, which is that Christians make up a greater proportion of the world's international migrants than any other religion. Okay? It's typically just slightly under 50%. In this recent data is 47. The previous one we had from 2012, it was 49. What are the numbers based on this Pew assessment? 131 million Christian migrants in the world, so to speak. This is the largest Christian migrant group, I would tell you, in the history of Christianity. Take a look at these numbers. I'm sorry, I'm moving through these slides maybe too quickly for you. But this is what we're looking at in terms of their presence in Europe and North America. 56% of all migrants in Europe. And by the way, I need you to compare, because in Europe in particular, Muslim immigrants get a lot of the focus and attention. The Christian migrant percentage is much higher. So in Europe, it's 56% of migrants as opposed to 18% who are Muslims. And in North America, 68% of all migrants who are Christian. Friends, the impact of this extensive Christian migration is evident in major cities in Europe and North America. You know them, you see them, you hear them. There are tons of examples. Harvey Koueni, I think in one of his articles, pointed out that people of African descent account for only 14% of London's population, but apparently make up 60% of church attendance in the city. Britain attracts many Filipino nurses. They come from a country that's 86% Christian. The 2022 influx of immigrants from Hong Kong saw Cantonese-speaking congregations in Britain double or treble in size. Friends, the levels of global Christian migration in our time is unprecedented in the history of Christianity. Not even the tidal wave of displacements in the wake of the Islamic and Mongol empires come close. In addition, these Christian global migrant flows have done so many other things beyond just Christian presence, which is what we think about for the most part. They have also galvanized a proliferation of influential Christian networks global networks, and transnational associations that unite believers and ministries across continents. Assessing the import and implications of these remarkable developments for Christian witness and the global church is one of the great missiological challenges of our time. It requires new tools. It requires fresh analytical frameworks. So I put it to you, the establishment of centers like this, what we are here to inaugurate, are simply vital for meaningful, long-term exploration of the great predicaments and unfolding manifold possibilities of this new era. Which is why I want, in closing, to point out that some of the existing analysis is troublesome. You see, the most common efforts to analyze this unprecedented rise in Christian migrant movement from the new heartlands of the Christian faith to the former are rooted in constructs that, in my view, are wedded to the empire logic and rooted in Western missionary models. The most common and pervasive is reverse mission. This concept has its roots in 19th century missionary thinking, originally expressed in the idea of blessed reflex, used by mission leaders to describe a time when sending churches in the West will be challenged and renewed by churches in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This prospect was also celebrated at Edinburgh 1910 when one of the commissions called attention to the fact that Christianity in Europe is destined to be recalled to forgotten graces by the infant church. Just ignore infant, because this is 1910. Well, anyway, you know what I'm saying. But you get the idea that these sentiments have been there within Western missionary thinking for some time. Friends, I'm fully aware of the popularity and appeal of the reverse mission concept. It has the pleasing ring of prophetic fulfillment. It also has a certain post-colonial salience that makes it popular among African scholars of religion. These are two groups that agree on very little else. And so that's something that should, capture your attention. But friends, reverse mission as a framework for assessing the rise of immigrant Christian communities and churches within Western societies is problematic and misleading, in my view, for many reasons. It reprises the long-standing but deeply erroneous view of foreign missionaries as primary agents of social change. It perpetuates that territorial, one-directional view of missions. It views global Christianity in terms of centers of institutional dynamism that coincide with who sends and who receives. In fact, as Kenneth Ross has pointed out, this is an outlook linked to the 19th century, he calls it, linear model of mission, where it is all about transmission of something from here to there. The reverse mission paradigm actually evokes a limited strand of missionary thinking while ignoring its lessons. That the entire church is called to mission, not a few trained specialists or particular nations. that the transformational impact of Western missions in Africa and elsewhere, on that impact on the Western church, actually happened in real time. It already happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. It wasn't a gift for future generations. Indigenous action and agency are indispensable for the rise of faith or revitalization of the church in any context. So reverse mission thinking is leading many to look at immigrant churches and criticize them for not having more Europeans. By the way, as far as I know, there is no corresponding expectation that the large population of European expats in Africa will be transformed in Africa by their encounters with African Christianity. The concept has analytical liability because it also invites simplistic comparisons that obscure the distinctive elements of this global Christian migrant phenomenon. The vastness of scale of population transfers involved. That the missionary action in this case is not linked to formal sending structures or tours of duty. It is rooted in long-term residency, dual citizenship, and multi-generational contribution. These are not here because they're missionaries. They are here with full participation in the labor force. For these Christian immigrants, missionary is not a primary status or official position. Their missionary function is linked to their being migrant outsiders, with all the predicaments that comes with. The movement is largely founded on social networks and family strategies, not shaped by structures of power, colonial or otherwise, or economic dominance. This missionary encounter, by the way, is also taking place in the shadow of Christendom. So migrant agency and its missionary possibilities is often stunted by the long-term effects of colonialism. So these Christian migrant missionaries have to deal with the reality of racial rejection and social marginalization. They have to deal with alienation from homegrown Christian groups and churches. And as I mentioned earlier, for many of those in my research, at least in the American context, the most painful experiences of hostility and rejection that they have experienced come from fellow believers. This movement has to deal with the fact that to some who are also part of the Christian family, the idea that refugees, asylum seekers, Nigerian trained doctors, Filipino nurses, Asian cab drivers can be sources of spiritual blessing is offensive. Because in their thinking, they should be recipients of Western Christian action and grace. A study by a Lifer research study earlier this year found that 40% of evangelicals in the U.S. view immigrants as objects of mission, almost exclusively. So reverse mission is a very strange concept when the presence of these same communities, well, it's viewed as missionary by some. They are viewed as objects of conversion by others, and they are considered a threat to Western Christian values by still others. That is its limitation. So in closing, existing assessments of the missiological significance, long-term outcomes of this historic development, in my mind actually have only just begun to scratch the surface. It's going to require significant resources and commitments and collaboration of Christian associations, churches, agencies, and so on, because this work is bigger than we think. And so, friends, the rise of immigrant Christian communities, at the very least we can say now, complicates assessments of Western Christianity. Consider that the church in Europe and North America has gained a combined total of 89 million new Christian believers by migration alone. If we're talking, as we mentioned earlier, about the gifts of the church, about what God is doing in the world, we encounter it virtually every day. In the U.S., the chief destination of the world's international migrants, Christians account for about 65% of the immigrant population. So by the most basic extrapolation, some 30 million Christians have been added to the American church by 2021. And so in many ways, it complicates analysis because this movement to some extent compensates for the erosion of Christian affiliation and may stall the pace of secularization in the short term. Because immigrant Christians maintain higher levels of church attendance, religious commitment, and spiritual vitality than the general population. They have also formed dynamic communities, built churches, fashioned innovative ministries, and created impressive transnational networks at a phenomenal rate. The easiest go-tos are Redeemed Christian Church of God. The best known has some 1,000 parishes in North America, 800 or so in the U.S. alone. The Church of Pentecost out of Ghana is another easier example. In my study, I discovered that in a 14-year period, the Church of Pentecost churches in the U.S. rose from 70 to 252. That's an increase of 300% in 14 years. So friends, they do not come as missionaries. If they try to, they will not be allowed in. They're not here as missionaries in any formal or primary sense. They are missionaries because they are migrants. But they are primarily migrants. Persons and communities whose movement was compelled in some shape or form. The traditional distinction between refugee and migrants, those who are forced to leave and those who leave for economic reasons, is also false. The majority of people will not leave if they don't have to. International migration is compelled in some sense. It is the degree of compulsion that we should be talking about. And so their presence, and I started with this, is a poignant indication that we live in a broken and violent world. For all those you see in ministry or all those you interact with, there are hundreds who died trying, who did not make it. Mothers with babies or with their children. There are many who face, I would have loved to put up slides for you, who even after they make it, have to deal with extreme abuse on a daily or weekly basis because they wanted to give themselves or their families a chance to live. They come from all walks of life. And they live among us as God's gift. So, the plight of migrants and the transformation associated with this influx is something that we need to attend to deeply and in ways that reflect our Christian calling and our sense of mission. This new phenomenon is an emphatic reminder of three important truths. A, that the spread of God's kingdom is not fully measurable by human standards, and it does not fully conform to human expectations. Secondly, that as at a minimum, partaking in God's mission calls for a readiness to see Christ in the stranger, the refugee, and the outcast. Thirdly, as we read in Acts 2, 1-7, the Word of God spreads most effectively when the powerless and the marginalized are welcome to the table. Thank you for listening.